Hello, everybody, and welcome. Very warm welcome to this rather special Knoca webinar this afternoon, where we are pleased to celebrate the launch of a fantastic and I think very much needed new book called We Need to Talk About Climate, How Citizens' Assemblies Can Help Us Solve the Climate Crisis. Nothing less than that. This is a practical and I think very thoughtful bringing together of a lot that we've learned about climate assemblies and how to make them as impactful as possible over the past several years of experimentation with them and efforts to understand that. Before we go any further, I will just point out that we are recording the event. Hopefully that's okay, and you've already clicked OK on the Zoom. If you prefer, of course, you can turn off your camera. Otherwise, if you feel like leaving it on, that's always nice. But yes, and it will be available as a recording afterwards. My name is Erica Hope, and I'm the director of the Climate Governance Programme at the European Climate Foundation, who proudly founded and still sponsor the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which is hosting today's event. And I'm very honoured to be your host, which is a role that is very often held by Graham Smith, who is Knoca's founding chair. But of course, today we see Graham move across to the speaker's role because he is the author of the book. And just to quickly run through how it's going to work today, Graham will, well, after I just set a few bits of context, Graham will speak for about 20 minutes to share the main themes of the book. And then we will have the honour of hearing from two wonderful commentators or panelists to share their thoughts on the book and the topic at hand. That's David Van Reybrouck and Kathryn Machin, who I will introduce properly a little bit later. And then all being well, we should have time for some questions from the virtual floor. But you can also use the chat function as we go along, so we can gather things up as we go. So I think that's it for the practicalities. Keep yourself on mute and all of that sort of thing as well. But to just briefly provide a little bit more context, and I start from the perspective of the European Climate Foundation. About 5 years ago, we started to pay attention to the emerging phenomenon of climate assemblies, or climate assemblies and citizens' assemblies on climate change. We're a foundation that has the mission to try and make Europe meet the Paris Agreement and be an effective actor in its global achievement. But it's become increasingly apparent that just paying attention to the sort of technical aspects of how to do that is not enough. And there's a whole variety of things that are needed, but of course, getting people's buy-in to the transition is at the heart of that. And at the time when we started to look at assemblies, the French Convention on Citoyens pour le Climat, the French Climate Assembly, was taking shape. And ECF's CEO, Laurence Tubiana, was serving as its co-chair or the co-chair of the governing committee. And Ireland had already had a climate assembly, and there was talk of one in the UK, and there were plenty of municipal ones bubbling up all over Europe. And at the same time, climate activists like Fridays for Future and XR were all starting to demand more structured ways of accessing decision making. And it was becoming evident that, as with climate policy, we were moving more deeply into the sort of implementation phase, away from kind of target setting and upstream changes like switching electricity supply from coal to gas, which doesn't affect a citizen directly, or at least not where you feel at home. As we were starting to move more towards requirements that actually affect people in their homes and in their daily lives, there starts to be a very real risk of popular backlash against the changes if people feel that they're being done to them without their having any say in it, and indeed a risk that they might be done in an unfair or unreasonable way. And of course, all of the concerns about vested interests and so on that are actually capturing the way policymaking is done in general. And so we realized there might be something in this novel way of trying to make decisions, which had been actually under development in some places, as I think David may tell us, for quite some time before that, but particularly in applying it to the challenges of the climate transition. And we thought that'd be really good if there was a place where experiences and insights from all of these different experiments could be brought together to permit a kind of ongoing collective learning as to how to do climate assemblies well, and how to make sure that the best of that knowledge so far was going to be available to people who wanted to run to assemblies, and that we keep moving forward the curve about how to innovate in this way. As newcomers to the democracy space from the Climate Foundation perspective, I have to sort of add the, I suppose, disclaimer that we have come to understand that assemblies are only one of a range of potential democratic tools that might help. We also, looking into that more now as well. But I think we still think that assemblies are a particularly compelling approach that have a great deal of potential. And all of this was the rationale for us eventually setting up the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, which was established officially in June 2021 under the wonderful leadership of Graham Smith and Democracy X, at that time the Danish Board of Technology. And most of you know Knoca, I think. That's how you've come to be here. But I think in that time, it's become really a very important community and sort of expertise hub, quite a vibrant learning space, and especially with its newly revamped website, a rich resource centre, and really the kind of, I like to think, the go-to place on climate assemblies that we hoped it would become. And this success, I think, has definitely been thanks to the efforts of the whole network. Many, many people have contributed. But we have to admit that at the heart of it all has been Graham Smith, Professor Graham Smith, who is a long-time expert on democratic innovation, and as well as chairing Knoca in an inimitably warm and wise and insightful and actually organised way, which is very helpful. He has a day job as a professor of politics at the Westminster University, and he's currently a visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris, working very hard on your French, I think, n'est-ce pas, Graham? So yes, I think, and one day Graham came to me and I promised it was his idea, and he suggested that perhaps he could write a book to bring together everything that the Knoca community has learned so far through its collective work, just with a bit more room to expand than the usual sort of very punchy briefings that we push for. And knowing that what Graham produces is generally worth having, and I even actually quite enjoy reading his grant proposals. He writes very well. We decided to support him in writing this, and we're certainly not disappointed. I hope many of you have had a chance to read the book. It's really fun and colourful read that's full of real examples and a very nice structured way of drawing out the insights of what we've learned so far and useful reflections on where we should go next on assemblies. But it's not for me to tell you what's in the book, that's for Graham. So without further ado, I would like to first thank Graham very much for doing this, and thank you all, of course, for being here to celebrate this this I think quite important launch. Yes, Graham, I would like to invite you to share with us some of its key themes and insights. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Erica. That's a really, really kind of you. And this isn't going to become a love. It may become just a love in the whole thing, but I just want to say it's been really great working for the European Climate Foundation because they've been so responsive to what we've wanted to do, and I don't think we could have done it with a different funder. So that's great. So thank you everybody for coming. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about what came from the idea behind the book and just some insights into it, into what's in the book and perhaps some of the things that aren't in it, having just written it. The reason why I wrote the book was because we've had this we've had an extensive explosion of assemblies. I mean, it sounds a lot, but of course, when you think about the number of public authorities, it's not that many, but it is a really interesting rise of climate assemblies since the French Convention, as Erica was saying. And what I wanted to do was in one book or in one short book was to actually, make that case for climate assemblies, try to make sense of what's been happening over the last few years, and to try and hopefully shape future directions and make sense of those future directions. I was saying this earlier to David, but I think one of the virtues, if there is a virtue of this book or a set of virtues, it's that it's short, that it's open, it's free, and that it has pictures in it. And I was trying to do it in as non-academic way as possible. There is a danger in this kind of space that one becomes too abstract, and I hope that that's been achieved to a certain degree. The other thing about the book is it's been written really fast. I mean, I had this conversation with Erica towards the end of last year. I think it was started writing in November and it's out now. And anyone who knows the publishing world is that's quite fast. So I've actually sort of looked, I would like to have had a bit more time, but that's not what this is about, because I thought it was really important to have a book out there, basically, because there's a lot being said about assemblies, citizens' assemblies, climate assemblies, deliberative democracy more widely. And there just aren't that many accessible places to actually read about. So I thought that was a really important reason. I want to sort of pay homage to the fact that a lot of this comes from the work of the Knowledge Network, as again was mentioned by Erica, especially towards the end of the book. These are things that we've been talking about in workshops, things we've been really trying to grapple with. And it also comes from, from a long line of academic work. But those of you who know my academic work, you can kind of see a trajectory which is going from the sort of theoretical work that I did when I was younger and the sort of much more sort of analytical political science work to much more sort of shorter, sharper ways of trying to engage on the issue. And actually, I was reflecting, the first book in there was actually my PhD thesis turned into a book called Deliberative Democracy and the Environment. And right at the end of that period when I was writing my PhD, I was really fortunate enough to go to a meeting in IPPR. This was in the mid-1990s, where Peter Dienel and Ned Crosby were there. And this was the inventor of the citizens' jury and the planning cell. And I suddenly saw this connection between some of the theoretical ideas that I was writing about and the kind of some practical examples of what this might look like in the real world. And that sort of, I think, I've tried to make that go throughout my work. And now I think I'm much more interested in using those kinds of academic ideas, but in ways that are actually useful for the world rather than just useful for the academy. So I just want to briefly talk about how I put the book together. And I want to spend more time towards the end around the questions about shaping the future and where we might be going. And I'm really hoping that David and Kat, who have been really great, and I really thank them for joining us, may have something to say about those areas. So quite simply, I'm not going to rehearse so much of this because many of you on this call know it. I start the book with a kind of argument about why climate assemblies, which talks about the mess we're in terms of climate governance, particularly the challenges of short-termism, challenges around the way that electoral cycles and the power of vested interest tends to mean that climate interests are relegated, and the sort of wider questions about why people are interested in participatory responses, particularly in relation to making better decisions that are more responsive to the lived experiences and the daily lives of people, and also questions of legitimacy, rather than doing things with people rather than to people. And then I focus more on why is it that within this participatory turn we've had this interest in assemblies, and it's really that power of the combination of democratic lottery and deliberation that I think is core here, and that kind of really differentiates the work that many of us in this space do on assemblies from other forms of participation. And as Erica said, this is not to discount other forms of participation. It is definitely not to say that citizens' assemblies are the only way of doing things. But I think citizens' assemblies do things that other participatory processes can't do. And I think there are things other participatory processes do that assemblies can't. But I think it's been really worth at this moment in time focusing on assemblies because there has been a political opportunity. And I think it's a really interesting question that I'll come back to towards the end as to whether that political opportunity will continue. I've tried in the book to make sense of the wave of climate assemblies. And, you know, we've missed loads. I know, just talking to colleagues in France at the moment, I realize that we've missed a whole bunch out that we didn't know about. But we know that there's been over 200 assemblies in the last 5 years. Most of them have been in Europe, but not all of them in Europe. There have been really interesting experiments in other OECD countries and also in the global south, which I think, you know, we really need to put more focus on. And I think I've just been involved in a report with International IDEA, which is focusing on the global south and how this mechanism might be reinterpreted within different political and cultural contexts. And I think that's really exciting. One thing I think we have learned is that, and that may sound obvious, but it isn't obvious to everybody, is that no two climate assemblies are the same. The graph that I show you here is a graph of the time span of different assemblies. So they range from, and here we're very judicious, we're very ecumenical with the way we use the term assemblies. We're talking about processes that combine sortition and deliberation. So they could be shorter jury. People use different names, but here we see in where am I thinking of? Sorry, I've just lost track of myself. Oh yes, in Finland, they ran a jury that was 1.5 days long. Compare that to the Climate Assembly in Scotland, or the Convention Citoyen in France. That's the only French you're going to get, by the way. That was like 8 weekends, and these are very different beasts. They're using the same basic technology, but they're very different beasts, and what we can expect from them is very different. The other thing this graphic does for us is also recognize that commissioners can be very different. Here I've distinguished between public authorities and civil society organized assemblies. I think there's a very different dynamic there. And within the public authorities ones, some have been done by heads of state, some have been done by ministries, and some have been done by parliaments. And that linkage with the political system has a very different effect onto what we can expect from assemblies. So, really this point about assemblies being incredibly different, and I am here focusing on national level, which I think are particularly interesting, but of course the same is also true for the majority which have been held at more local levels. The third, have I just skipped it? Oh yes, so also we can think, I think in the second chapter I spend a lot of time unpacking the different elements of an assembly and how they've differed, but also focusing on questions about what is it that citizens want. And it's quite clear that when citizens are given the space and time and knowledge and input, not just into this, and they have the time to reflect and share stories, actually what they're looking for is much more radical than governments are proposing, much more willing to take on sufficiency policies that reduce consumption and production, much more willing to push for regulatory policies rather than market-based solutions. I think it's a very interesting difference and some really interesting studies into that. And at the same time, we have seen, even with out of this variety of assemblies, a whole series of different impacts on policy. For example, in Ireland, even in France, in Luxembourg, we've seen effects on institutions. In the UK, the Climate Change Commission is actually running more deliberative exercises. We are seeing impacts on public discourse in certain countries, like again, France and Ireland come to mind, where assemblies have actually really changing the nature of political debate around climate and biodiversity loss. And we're seeing some really interesting evidence of the long-term effect on participants. So these are really significant effects, but they are not universal. They are not systematic across assemblies. And partly this is because of some really simple failures in practice. And the third chapter of the book, I really focus on some of what's been a lot of the core work of Knoca, trying to identify what those problems are and where those challenges are. And I'm really focused on 4 areas, and I won't go into them too much detail, read at your pleasure and your leisure, is that we don't always get the remit right. We're often asking citizens to do things which have no connection to the actual policy process, or which have no connection to an impact strategy. So we're often asking the wrong question at the wrong time. And I think that's deeply problematic. This isn't to say, for example, that we should always be asking very policy specific questions, but we should be thinking about how the particular questions that we're asking are relevant to the political climate that we're operating in. A lot of the early assemblies just simply said, how do we solve the climate crisis? Way too broad. But then that isn't but there are times when opening up broad questions is really legitimate. So I'm not saying there's a right way of doing this, but we've got to be much more careful on those questions. Again, I think we're really good at designing assemblies. We know what to do. We aren't very good at designing what happens afterwards. We haven't put enough effort into that. It was really telling for me when we started doing work on this, when I went round to a lot of practitioner organizations and said, I've seen your guide for running an assembly. Where's your guide for landing the assembly? Where's your guide for preparing the public authority? Where's your guide for bringing in other actors? And it just didn't exist. And one of the work I think we've been doing, which I think is really profound in this area, is this idea of designing for impact at the same time as you are designing the participatory process, if you like. I think this is familiar stuff for many of us on this call, but it has been forgotten, it has been neglected. And I don't think it's only assemblies this is true of. I think a lot of us get really obsessed by the citizen engagement bit and not enough work being done around engagement of public officials and public organizations around the assembly. The same true is about stakeholders. Many of the proposals that come out of assemblies are not for governments, they're for other actors, and yet those other actors are not brought into the process. And I think there are really interesting ways that assemblies are trying to do that now. And the final area is really around communication and public engagement into the broader public and broader publics. I don't think we know what a good media strategy looks like. I don't think we know how to communicate these. We don't understand why, we would spend, you're a very strange group of people. You're on this call at the moment, but most people don't care. Most people don't know about this. Most people, and how do we communicate this? And I think we haven't done that work, and it is absolutely vital work. Some assemblies have had break cut through, most haven't. So those are the areas where I think the standard assembly practice, particularly those that are government organized, where we can do a much better job. But at the end of the book, I wanted to kind of think about where we're going in this space. And I kind of saw a range of things that I think are happening. I don't give an answer as to where this is going to go. I just think it's very difficult when you're within it to actually see the shape of it. But there are 4 areas where I think there's some particularly interesting things for us to reflect on. The first is this emergence of permanent assemblies. This is a very sort of diagrammatic schematic of the Brussels Permanent Assembly. And this is where we see one in Milan as well, and a couple of other places are looking at the moment. And this is where there's a recognition that we can't just do one-off engagement. We need constant engagement of citizens around climate policy, around climate strategy. And so they're creating these annual cycles. And I think this is really fascinating also for thinking about how you land these assemblies, because it means that public officials get used to them as a form of input, a regular form of input. And David was who's going to be talking in a minute, was one of the leaders of designing this. I was very privileged to be part of that group. But I think this is a really interesting development. But I don't think it comes with risks, because I think one of the dangers here is one could say this is too close to administrations. It's too easy potentially for administrations to co-opt these kind of processes. So are there particularly institutional safeguards that we need to build into the system? And I think in this example, we do, through things like the follow-up committee and the agenda committee which has been established in Brussels. But I think it's a really interesting question. Permanent isn't always the best move, but it is a really interesting move. So that one dynamic, I think, is those public authorities who are taking this kind of process seriously and embedding it. The other dynamic, I think, goes in a different direction. And this is civil society organizing assemblies. I think most of us are imaginary. The way that we think of these things is, certainly for me, for a long time has been, this is a process that is commissioned by government. But there's no reason that an assembly with its use of sortition and deliberation can't be used by other actors. And here I've just kind of given a sort of just thrown up some really interesting examples. The one at the top left-hand corner is the Polish Assembly on energy costs, which was run by the Shipyard Foundation. The Bugarat Klima was organized by 2 civil society organizations in Germany. That was aimed to affect the federal elections and the coalition agreements afterwards. And the most recent Climate Assembly of Skopje was organized by the ZIP Institute, because they recognize that government isn't trusted to do these sorts of things. So those 3 were really focused on trying to get government action and action by state actors. But then we get some really interesting developments like, and Kathryn Machin, who's going to be speaking in a minute, was one of the architects of this. The People's Assembly for Nature in the UK was organized by 3 civil society organizations. And their primary focus wasn't government. Government was one of their focuses, but they're also focusing on stakeholders, their own organizations, the broader public. They wanted to create a plan for nature, which was, if you like, owned by citizens and came from civil society, which has a power, I think, that a government organized process doesn't. It starts from a different place. And I think this is really interesting. I think the Global Assembly has a similar kind of logic. And there's big debates amongst Global Assembly actors as to whether it is better that this stays independent within civil society or docks with particular global institutions. I think that's a really interesting debate to have. And both, I think, the People's Assembly for Nature and the Global Assembly are pointing to this idea that potentially these could be the basis of creating a different sort of infrastructure that in academic terms is like a counterpower to the state. It's actually created as a different center of power that is independent from the state. And I think that's a really interesting and exciting way of thinking. The last image on that actually comes from an organization in the UK called Humanity Project. And they are definitely trying to produce independent modes of governance. They're trying to link people's assemblies and citizens' assemblies. And their view is we need to build a different governance. The state isn't doing what we need it to do. Let's create alternative forms of structure. And they're using assembly type logics to do that. And I find this really exciting. And it's very different from the permanent assemblies. It's a very different set of logics. So I think this is a really exciting agenda, but again, comes with risks, because the danger here is that the assembly model becomes associated with particular radical social movements or particular organizations that are then seen as illegitimate by other actors within society. And I think this is a real challenge. I'm not sure how to negotiate it. And Kat had some and her colleagues had some really interesting ways of creating firewalls between themselves, the commissioners, and the assembly. But I think it's something we need to grapple with, because I think there's a real danger there and of course real opportunities. The other area I think that we're seeing interesting developments is in systems thinking. And I think about this in three ways. I think in the book, I only talk about two. I think I forgot the third, but that, when you write a book fast, you sometimes forget things. But the first way of thinking about this is who's in the room. And I think some of the assemblies have begun to think really interestingly about who's missing. And one group of people who's missing are young people. And so, for example, in Ireland, they ran a separate young people's assembly with children as young as 7 in it, right the way from 7 to 16. And that's really interesting, bringing those people who at the moment aren't enfranchised. That then brings the question about, well, what about future generations? And then we see some really interesting practice from Japan in terms of thinking about future design and making and putting people in the position of people in 50 years or 100 years time. And then we see some really interesting work being done about non-human nature and trying to, Mission Publique have done some interesting work in this space of trying to get people to use, often using kind of meditation techniques and similar, to try and bring non-human nature present into the room. And for example, like the Children's Assembly in Ireland, going out into nature to do work. And I think these are really interesting developments of trying to think who should be in the room and how can they be party to these deliberations. The other element of systems thinking is that one of the criticisms of assemblies is they're often a bit too policy focused, as in they're in the same policy silos as government. And can we get assemblies to think more systemically? And that comes into questions about how do we bring systems thinking and design thinking into assemblies. Now, it may be that doing that undermines the assembly model and it's just too much. I don't know, but I think it's really exciting to try. And some people like the Swedish Climate Assembly have been trying to do some of that work. And the other bit of systems thinking that I didn't really mention in the book, but is implicit, is this way of trying to think about how do assemblies fit in with the system, the political system. And I think in a way, I've already mentioned this in relation to permanent assemblies and civil society assemblies. They have very different models of how they work within the political system. So I think this idea of systems thinking in terms of the constituency, in terms of the way that we actually structure learning within assemblies, and also the question about fit within the political system, I think are really, really critical areas of work. Then the final thing I wanted to think about was the movement. And I actually think there is a movement for citizens' assemblies and climate assemblies. I don't think it always sees itself as a movement, but I think it's one of the interesting things for me, which seems to differentiate what's happening at the moment, particularly in Europe, from what I've seen before around other sorts of participatory processes. Because in Knoca, we have people who are senior government officials. in Knoca and on this call, and we have some officials on this call, we also have activists from social movements. And we have people in between. We have academics, we have practitioners. This is an incredibly diverse group of people who are all talking about assemblies. They don't always talk about them in the same way, but that's a kind of community of practice, which I think is really extensive and is really interesting and needs to be cultivated. And I think there are two groups of actors who are, if you like, really key to this movement, we're starting to see their presence. The first is citizens themselves who have been through these processes and want to see more of them. 95% of people who go through a citizens assembly want to do it again and think there should be more of them. And they are really amazing advocates for assemblies. The other group are artists and cultural actors who are starting to think about, how do we think about cultural reproduction in this space? The reason I put these two images up is because I wanted to capture the diversity of the movement. On the left-hand side, you have the Climate Change Committee, which is an organisation that is required under our climate law within the UK to review the government's movements towards its commitments under the Paris Agreement. And they are using deliberative processes because the person who headed Climate Change Committee was one of the expert witnesses or expert leads at Climate Assembly UK. And he is all for assemblies, and he thinks assemblies can really help shape, kind of established institutions. At the other end, we have this Extinction Rebellion kind of argument, looking to create these much more radical spaces with assemblies. These two groups of people are in the same space. But I also know that people like the head of the Climate Change Committee is very critical about Extinction Rebellion and thinks that they're undermining the case, and that Extinction Rebellion meant that the government didn't respond to Climate Assembly UK. But on the same token, I don't think Climate Assembly UK probably would have happened without Extinction Rebellion doing the work that they did. So we've got this tension, and I think all good movements have this tension. But I think it's a tension we've got to learn to live with, because I think different parts of the movement are looking for different things. But I think the interesting thing is that there is some sort of movement here, and we have to try and make sense of it. And Knoca is some sort of actor within that space. So just finally, I want to say that I wrote the book, but you are all responsible. Everyone on this call and everyone within the knowledge network of climate assemblies has some sort of input into this book. There are no royalties for this. It's free to access. So I'm afraid I can't share the money with you because there is no money. But the book would not exist without Knoca. Now, this is my interpretation of the work that we've all done together. I don't claim it is Knoca's position. This is very much my take on it. And I really hope that this is a book that, first of all, that is something you feel you can share. I think for a lot of us, I'd really like to give somebody something to read and to do, and usually it's like bits of reports and bits of this and bit of that. I hope this book can play a function for you in helping open up people's imagination and getting people to actually think seriously about this space. And most of all, I hope it's part of the debate. I hope people react. I don't hope they react badly to it. I obviously don't want that, but I hope people react to it. I hope people pick me up. I hope that actually that this is part of, if you like, part of that movement, because this is a really interesting opportunity for us to really reshape climate governance. As Erica said, there are things that we cannot do in terms of the climate transition without serious and meaningful and deep engagement with citizens. For my own part, I think some of that has got to be deliberative in nature. Otherwise, it won't have the impact and power that we need. I offer this at this moment in time as my contribution to that debate. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy. I hope you enjoy reading it. I hope you share it widely. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Graham. Thank you very much for that very concise and I think engaging canter through the book. It's you really hear your voice come through actually when you read the book, but it's nice to hear you talk through it. And I think for my part, I think you've done a really impressive job of wresting what is quite a diverse field that can be quite hard to get a handle on into a really kind of crunchy and manageable set of insights and kind of lines to pursue. And as you say, it's not the definitive answer to anything. It's not the Knoca's position or anything, but I think it gives everybody kind of an agenda to work to, which is wonderful. And I think it also reflects that it's an exciting field with a nice balance of kind of organic innovation that's happening in many different places, but also an effective spreading of good ideas, which we need to continue. So to go into some of those themes a bit more, I'd like to turn to our esteemed panelists. I would like to first introduce David Van Reybrouck, who is another author, among many other things. David is the author of Congo and Revolution and Against Elections, among others. But he's also a very influential activist in the assembly space and more recently in climate politics. He's the founder of G1000, which he may tell us a bit more about that, perhaps, and of the Federation for Innovation and Democracy in Europe. And he's a designer of some of those permanent assemblies, well, actually the permanent assemblies that Graham was talking about there, the Brussels Region Climate Assembly and others. And I know he will have some very interesting thoughts to share. So David, if I may ask you to just share some general reflections on Graham's book and presentation, and perhaps in particular your hopes and fears for a new wave of permanent climate assemblies, and maybe the movement question as well. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica, for this introduction. And thank you so much to you, Graham, for having written this book. Over the past 5 years, I was sometimes wondering, when I got another invitation for a Knoca webinar on one specific aspect of climate assemblies, like, what on earth are they doing and how is this going to end up into a synthesis one day? I didn't see it. But today we have that synthesis. And I have to say, the book, Graham, that you have been just presenting is actually an impressive compendium of climate assemblies, past, present, and future. And I really want to congratulate you as a person, as the author, but also the entire Knoca network for having done an outstanding job. If climate assemblies are about the wisdom of the crowds, this book is about the wisdom of the crowds. You wrote it as a critical expert, giving practical advice in a very readable fashion, a highly legible book. And at the same time, you're an enthusiast, but not a blind enthusiast. You know where the shortages and the challenges are. So excellent. I think the book is going to be seen as a milestone as it brings together the first wave of climate assemblies that we've seen over the past couple of years. Now, Erica asked me whether what are my hopes and my fears for a second wave, for a new wave. And I think in order to answer that question, I have to make a distinction between what I hope and what I fear. I'm hoping for a second wave, bigger, bolder, more coherent, more ambitious, and more impactful than what we've seen in the first wave, for sure, based on the lessons from Graham's book. But what I fear is the very opposite. It may be that the first wave might become the last wave as well. This is 2024. We all know that the next couple of 5 to 10 years are going to be crucial in terms of tackling the major challenges ahead of us. And if we see the new governments that are taking power as we speak in a number of European countries, it doesn't bode well. The European elections have deeply reshuffled the functioning of the European Parliament, and the European Commission, as being pulled together, has shown less ambition in terms of tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, and related topics. It seems as if the momentum is over. You see it in the Dutch government, in the new one, you see it in the Belgian government that is being built right now, you see it in the fresh French government, and the recent elections in Germany also show that some space for ecological action is over. That's one reason for my fear. The second one is that climate assemblies have become very complex and very expensive. They demand considerable amounts of effort, time, and resources, which are not always there. And so these conditions function as a brake to a successful second wave. Thirdly, third reason for concern is that the deliberative sector, of which many people are present in this call, is growing, but we're still very tiny. And much of our work is going into internal work and not in external work. We've become better and better at designing processes, especially the three phases, the phase before a panel, the panel itself, and the panel afterwards. We've become very good at phase 1 and phase 2, and Graham rightly says we're still not good at phase 3, the impact, the aftermath. However, we have come to believe that the answer to that challenge is improving design. And we speak about designing for impact. But what if impact is only partially conditioned by design? What if impact is only partially a function of how we run phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3? There is a fallacy, I think, in the deliberative sector to believe that everything is in design. It is not. It's in power, it's in politics, it's in power relations, and we haven't been very good at it so far.
Yes. Oh, there's chicken.
Somebody's mic is on. I'm happy to engage with you, but it's a bit early at that moment of my intervention.
It's muted now.
So we are too slow, we are too small, we are too silent, we are too isolated, and we're also too kind. And Graham, in your book, you refer to what happened to participatory budgeting. After a very promising start in the 1990s, it's all over. There's another historical parallel. This might happen to climate assemblies as well. After a very, very promising start at the late 2010s, it might be over by 2030. But recently, I've been delving a little bit into the history of the international peace movement that characterized intellectuals in Europe between 1890 and 1914. Just like us, they had all the good ideas. They had major realizations, bigger than what we've achieved so far. They had treaties, they had tribunals, they had the Treaty of Geneva, of The Hague, the conventions on warfare, they had institutions, they had power, and yet they could not stop World War I. What we've seen in Europe today is deeply worrying. Since the 1980s, socioeconomic inequality has arisen and has become dramatic as of now. Since the 1990s, democratic disappointment has been growing, and the banking crisis, migration crisis, pandemic, and energy crisis have not helped. Since the 2010s, we've seen the disruption of social media. Since the 2020s, we've seen an accumulation in just a few years of climate catastrophes, war at a time and in places we no longer thought it was possible. We've seen the end of the international order and the end of international law. And on top of that, we have runaway machine learning, artificial intelligence. And we are there, absolutely nowhere. A second wave, I would wish so. But to be honest, I fear collapse. Collapse of infrastructure. Climate change might make railways and critical infrastructure like roads impracticable, or rivers. Food security will no longer be guaranteed. I fear democratic collapse with authoritarian regimes that may come back, with the rule of law disappearing. Already the rule of contestation is disappearing. I fear state collapse as well, even in Europe. Countries may fall apart. Are the United States going to remain united by 2040? We'll see. State institutions may fall apart from internal rot or from external factors like revolutions or coups d'etats. There might be a world order collapse in terms of international orders falling apart, international law disappearing, and AI might even bring about reality collapse, that we don't agree on this, the most basic definitions of what counts as true. Does that mean that the work we do and the book that Graham is presenting today is futile, that it is too late? Absolutely not. But I think the time has come that we have to prepare a double action. And the double action consists of 2 lines. The first one is avoiding the crash. The second one is preparing the aftermath. When it comes to avoiding the crash, Graham has given a number of interesting examples. Scaling up will be essential. Having more and more people access to these panels is important. People want this, especially the ones who are least educated, especially the poor people. People who are most frustrated by democracy are most begging for citizens' assemblies. So we have to be able to scale up. And that means that we have to make them cheaper and easier to run. Using AI to capture and to cluster input might be one step. But using the output of all the climate assemblies, Graham, that you have brought together in the book, what has been the consolidated knowledge coming out of these climate assemblies? Why would Austria repeat what Luxembourg has done before? Why should the Czech Republic repeat what Ireland has decided? We're not all that different. So I think some integration, some clustering of what's on the table in terms of recommendations might be really useful in order to speed up. We need more impact, and I think the best way to create more impact is including the outgroup. And it's not just about communication. Yes, these are transformative experiences for participants, but we'll have to invest beyond communication, making possible that lay audiences, the maxi public, the outgroup has a say through input, and AI-generated clustering again might play an important role here. But apart from input, there should also be forms of output. We will need collective validations of what citizens' assemblies decide, and a referendum or a preferendum at the end of an assembly might be important. That in terms of avoiding the crash, this is work we still can do, and I agree with all the measures that Graham has given. And my final point is that we need to prepare the aftermath. Social welfare states that came about in the post-war world in the 1950s, all the ideas were there already in the late 1930s. It was experts, the ideas were there. And in the aftermath of war, experts put it together. Which means that we have to do the same thing. All the good ideas are there, but we need to strengthen the movement. We need to reach out to political parties. We need to reach out to administrations and top civil servants, and Graham stresses that point very much in his book. We need to reach out to media outlets, to academic expertise, civil society organizations, but not just the ecological ones. These are the easy ones. But labor unions, health organizations, welfare organizations, migrant organizations, those who fight poverty, those who fight racism, we have to establish these connections right now. The umbrella under which we are should get much more crowded. The business community should be part of that exchange. And surprisingly, and it's a category of people we never talk about because we don't think violence is on our way, but the military should be part of the coalition we are building as well. So to conclude, I read Graham's book with enthusiasm, yes, for the future, but also with nostalgia for a past in which we might still have imagined a different future. I'm not sure that optimistic future is still within reach. I'm not sure whether we'll have a second wave. I fear a collapse, but we definitely are going to need a second act, and we need to be ready for when the time is there. Thank you.
Thank you, David, very much for those sobering, but I think very honest reflections. I think it's very good to have this reality check. It's provocative, but I think things we need to be thinking about. And you've actually, added a whole other range of things that I think as a movement we need to be working on. And I think one of my questions, personally deep down inside, even just with excitement when reading Graham's book, is can we do all this in time, given the imminence of the climate problem and all of the others that are coming on us? And I think you've given us some food for thought there. Part of the answer to that, of course, might be civil society organised initiatives and so on. So I would like to now turn to Kathryn Machin, who is the head of community engagement campaigns at WWF-UK. Kat is one of the organisers and architects, indeed, of the People's Assembly for Nature, which created the People's Plan for Nature, a wonderful and I think fairly unprecedented initiative which combined a national conversation with a People's Assembly and the making of a plan and also a documentary series. It was a very well thought through campaign. And one of probably the most high profile civil society organised initiatives in this domain to date. So it would be lovely to hear from you, Kat, if you don't mind. Again, your general reactions to Graham's book, and perhaps in particular some lessons that you've learned from that process, and what the future might be for CSO commissioned assemblies, and potentially what role they might play in addressing the challenges that that David has also further set out for us. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you, and thank you as well to David. That was a hugely powerful intervention, as Graham said in the chat, and reflective of a lot of the things we've been thinking of. Graham, my first reflection of reading your book was how much I wish I'd had it 3 years ago when I was trying to develop the People's Assembly for Nature. It is such a useful tool when we want to consider how do we actually design and make citizens' assemblies that are inclusive and impactful and have the effect that we're hoping for. I definitely went into the People's Assembly with more optimism than I've ever had, and actually came out with more optimism as a result. But as time has gone by, it's been really difficult to grasp exactly what the impact has been. And there's been a lot of my time spent trying to kind of pull together evidence of that. And thanks to ECF as well, because they've helped to fund evaluations of the People's Assembly, which hopefully will be in a position to share externally in the next couple of months. I actually, if we're going to go off what David has just gone through, the thing that I feel that citizens' assemblies give us outside the realm of climate is actually a shift in the narrative that we're currently facing into, which is polarizing citizens across the world. So we're seeing more and more polarization of narrative. And the biggest example I have seen of that counter narrative is what happens through the process of a citizens' assembly. When you get a really representative section of society together with one goal in mind, they do reach consensus, and they do so as long as the conditions are set right in a way that is really genuinely quite respectful and builds friendships across political divides in a way that I've never seen, and has completely transformed the lives of assembly members. And what you get then is advocates of a system that could be fairer, could place social justice at the heart of crises that have been, to this point, mostly looked at through a scientific lens, and could counter a lot of the things that we're facing into if we give it space and time to. One of the kind of key takeaways I was reading about, especially in the section that was related to civil society organising of citizens' assemblies, was potentially that opportunity to create the political space to do that in a way that is outside of the systems that are very bureaucratic, potentially more slow, potentially more driven by political narratives than maybe by the targets that we've set ourselves against IPCC reports and other really essential scientific targets. However, when I was reading the book, I was reflecting on what is our role in this space. What I don't want to inadvertently do through the process of creating something like the People's Plan is dilute the purpose of citizens' assemblies more broadly. And there is a risk of that. And I think Graham actually speaks to that really eloquently in his book, talking about how different roles can be taken by different states. But is there a risk that if more and more campaigning organisations take this on, is it being seen as a process and as a wedge issue in itself? And then you've inadvertently countered a polarised situation by polarising the very process that could combat that. As I've been thinking about the People's Assembly and the People's Plan, though, I do think there is a really significant role in people's assemblies in bringing together sectors that don't work together particularly well. So I work in the nature sector in the UK. We are all colleagues and peers, but our organizations don't necessarily set agendas thinking about the mosaic of the movement that we are part of. And so you see replication time and time again. WWF is guilty of this many times over, as are our colleagues that also commissioned the People's Plan, National Trust and RSPB. We could all do well to sit and listen to citizens and understand what are the strengths that we can play to. And the People's Plan is a real gift in that sense, because it gives us the ability to see what citizens expect from us, what they expect from businesses, and what they expect from other stakeholders within government. And just to give a bit of context around that for anyone who hasn't seen the People's Plan or read about it, we designed it in a way that wasn't just focused in on government policy, specifically because we were operating in a really tough political climate. We'd had like 5 prime ministers, I think, in the time between starting to think about the People's Plan and then actually getting it out the door. And the public trust in politicians was at an all-time low in the UK, and I'm sure that's been reflected across many parts of Europe as well. So we wanted to develop a plan that gave us that overarching ability for citizens to see where they connect in and where democracy plays out beyond the realms of the corridors of power in Westminster. And I think that is actually a fundamental strength of the People's Plan, and what could give it the legs that will hopefully have a lasting legacy. We're not necessarily seeing direct policy impact at this point, but we have seen interventions from businesses who have stepped up to the call for them to invest further in communities. And the Co-op, which is one of the supermarkets in the UK, is working now with our organisations and enabling 18 neighbourhoods across the UK to develop their own plans for nature at a very, very local level and connect that back into their own local authorities. So we're seeing this rippling effect that's happening really locally. We've also seen that capacity building is happening across the sector, and there's more deliberative democracy or more deliberative practice, more co-design being kind of taking place, more mainstreamed across the sector. So we're not falling into our old traps of just developing things because we think that's what the science says and we know what's best. We are doing better in that sense. And actually, I think it does hold government's feet to the fire when we can demonstrate that other areas of the People's Plan are being acted upon and they're trailing behind. So there is this constant going back and accountability piece that if we can maintain momentum, we can do. Just to speak on civil society organisations and some of the risks I think we are facing into, longevity is one of them. So it was an impact that a piece that Graham speaks to in the book is about you need to have a long tail to these citizens' assemblies. They happen over 4 to 8 weekends, however long they've been commissioned for, and then they go out into the world and they get pushed into an office and they might sit on a desk for so many weeks. We need to keep the resource on. We need to keep campaigning around that. We need to keep the momentum up of these citizens' assemblies. And there is a real risk if they're commissioned by civic society organisers that is dependent entirely on funding and where that comes from, and making sure that there is people within the organisations to keep pushing it forward. I mean, we have struggled to do that within the campaigning realms of our organisations, and we're 3 of the largest charities in the UK. So we have to be really realistic with that. What I'd love to see speaks actually to David's point, is commissioning of citizens' assemblies across different actors so that each organisation can play to their strengths. So a government commissioning body sitting alongside a civic society organising body, sitting alongside a business or somebody who has a really important stake and can drive those forward. I think that could be a really exciting and interesting way that civil society can connect in with citizens' assemblies further. All of it is really great. And Graham, congratulations again on the book, because it's not often that I can sit down and read nearly 200 pages in a couple of sittings. I'm very distracted very quickly, but I really did just sit down and I could not stop reading it. I think it's a fantastic just bringing together of all of these different initiatives. I think we're at a really interesting place in history. And to the comments that we've just heard, there are so many different ways in which the world could go. But I find that the greatest hope is where we do have citizens, and we have citizens at the heart of what we're doing, and citizens' assemblies are at the absolute forefront of that. And it has been an absolute privilege to have worked on the People's Plan for Nature, and it has completely shaped the way that my career will go forward from here. And hopefully it continues to shape the way that our organisations are working. So yeah, congratulations again, and thank you for having me on the panel. It's been an absolute privilege, and yeah, very happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Kat. Wonderful thoughts there as well. Lots to chew on. And I think to your point about actually if civil society is going to be supporting this, there's the need for kind of funding and wider support for that. One trend that I think is quite interesting and that I hope is going to go somewhere is actually civil society organisations, certainly who work on climate and who fund climate activities, but also on other topics, start to recognise that there's a fight for democracy that needs to be fought, and a fight to kind of enhance and diversify that. And actually it's a bit of a pointless exercise to be doing a lot else of what we do if we don't actually have the fundamental structures and places to do that. So I really am delighted to see these kind of initiatives and hope that can be a trend that continues on the funding side as well as on the activist side. Graham, there is so much there for you to respond to. I'll leave it up to you which parts of it you want to respond to, but I would thank again our panel very much for those extremely enriching and thought-provoking comments. And I'd invite also anybody who's joining online, please do share your questions and thoughts in the chat. We hope to have at least a few minutes to have a couple of those after Graham's responded to the panelists. Graham.
I knew when I asked these two to respond that it would cause me more of a headache than it was. But that's what we should do. We should. And so this is really. I mean, David's intervention was just. I mean, is highly profound. It really raises an interesting question about the framing of the book actually, and because I have your concerns and your analysis in mind, and it was I actually, and this may be a mistake, but I actually made a decision to downplay some of that because I felt that I wanted to write this book and I don't know whether that's a mistake. Do you know what I mean? It's a really interesting question. So I leave that open. But I think what I just want to say a couple of things. One is, and I think goes across both of what David and Kat has said. I wish I hadn't used the word designing follow-up. I wish I hadn't said that now, because I think the point that I want to make is that we haven't as a community developed solid impact strategies. And I think that strategy isn't just a design job. It's a political job. It's, and I know this from, I don't think I'm giving Kat said this herself in her talk, but I know from talking to Kat that if only I knew now what I knew, now when I'd started the project, then would have been so much helpful, is that we've got so entranced by the methodology and the technology of doing this, and we just so love being in the room with citizens when they do this work, but that's done on a sort of trust that something will come out the other end of it. And I just don't, and I think what we've had as a community is the belief that there'll be a moral power of assemblies that will somehow shift these entrenched political and economic and social structures. That is probably the naivest political strategy that you could ever have, and is dangerous. Is actually dangerous. So I want to sort of align myself with what's been said there. And I think what's really interesting is that I don't think it's necessarily what was done with the People's Plan, but what the People's Plan shows us is that. And another one is broadening our imagination of how we can use this technology and this way of working with citizens. And it's interesting because I think there's the double play that David mentioned, this sort of engaging with the politics of now and trying to do what we can, but at the same time recognizing that we need to build for a different future. We need to build for a warming world. We need to build for a world that is much more fragile than the one that we inherited. I actually think that assemblies can contribute to both of those things. I don't think we spend enough work on the second. I don't think we spend enough time on so, but there are activists out there who are thinking about that. But interestingly, I think some of the people doing that work are seen as outliers within our community. They're seen as troublemakers because they're causing, because they're sort of undermining the sort of reputation of this as a mainstream way. And I think there's a real tension here. But for me, in all the most important political change, that tension has existed between those people who are more, inverted commas, I don't mean this in a rude sense, conservative and want to work with the system, and with those who can see that these things could be system changing. And I believe that those things, I hold, and I think that's as a movement, we somehow need to hold that together. And what's key to whichever side of that argument you're on, if you work on both sides of it, it's not really a sides, but if you're working in this area, being really clear about impact strategies is really fundamental to me, absolutely fundamental, whether we're thinking about the avoiding the crash or preparing the aftermath, as David was saying. And I think that one of the nice things that is honest about the People's Plan work, and I think is true of 99.9% of these projects, is we haven't done enough work on that, and we all wish we had after. But now, so for me now, the second wave knows that. The people who are working now know that. The people that we work with, engage with Knoca, we say to them, we're not just interested in your climate assembly design, what's happening around it? What's your strategy there? So I think there will be a second wave. I don't know what it looks like, and I don't know who will be driving it. My distinction between permanent and civil society organizations was one of the ways of thinking about that. But I think it's really exciting. And I think there aren't that many. I sometimes worry that this is a nice illusion that's keeping me from a sort of depressing state of the world. It's kind of like it's illusory. But I also know that isn't the case, because I've seen the power of these things. Now the question is how we harness them. What is the impact? So I'm going to repeat myself, and I could be on a cycle endlessly here. But I think for me, that's whether we're working within the mainstream or whether we're working to try and develop an alternative future, that question has to be really key.
Thank you, Graham.
Just one other thing, sorry, and I just wanted to say in response to something that Kat said, my very good friend Jamie Kelsey-Fry uses the term, he calls assemblies anti-polarization machines, which I think is a really, really, really nice term. And there aren't many. We have a lot of polarization machines. We don't have many anti-polarization machines, and we should celebrate any that we have. And I think it's a value that we can really push, and one we don't push enough.
Thank you, Graham. David, Kat, would you like to respond to what Graham said? You don't have to, but let me know.
Perhaps very briefly, Erica. I think it's an important insight to realize it's not all just about design. That for me is key. It's about building a movement, about seizing power, or not being afraid of seizing power. Sounds too militant. I see the tension that, Graham, that you referred to between a more conservative attitude within the system and a more militant attitude without the system. But I would be hesitant to say that those who work on real impact are not necessarily the more militant side. You can be working within the system, while at the same time being really ambitious in terms of impact. And that is a combination of the way you design it, because it is part of the equation, is part of your communication and media strategy, and it's also part of the way you position yourself. We've been very ancillary. We've been very much servile to the powers that be. We've considered ourselves to be like the grandchildren of those in power. We should see them as brothers and sisters. And I think we can remain kind, but be more, what's the good word here? More confident somehow in the change we can bring to the table. And that is not just design, it's a matter of attitude as well.
Thank you. Kat?
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, one of the things that we've been reflecting on, so when we commissioned the People's Plan, we were very nervous, to the point I raised earlier, of being seen to be using citizens' assemblies as a campaigning tool. It was always designed and intended to be independent from us, that we commissioned it so that it would exist in the world. And from there, we would be able to campaign behind it. But on reflection, I think we were over cautious. And actually, the impact that could have come if we'd have put all of our weight behind it and been really trusting in the fact that we designed the process independently, and we had the right advisory groups, and we followed all the right guidance. We created an independent citizens assembly, but we should have really thrown everything at it when it came to communicating it. And we threw quite a lot at it, and we connected it in with the David Attenborough television series. But the links could have been much closer. And it was a deliberate choice not to make it that close. And as we started to move through the Save Our Wild Isles campaign, it became harder and harder to connect them back together once we'd made that decision early doors. So I would suggest that there does need to be a transformational shift. And one of the things that I wish we'd done more of, which was referenced in the book as well, was the national conversation. So before we launched the Citizens Assembly, we went out to the UK public and asked them 3 very simple questions about their connection to nature, and asked for examples of where they could see people and nature thriving together. And we got 30,000 submissions. Now, that could have been much bigger if we'd have got it into every National Trust property. We got it into some, if we'd got it into various different community areas, and if we'd have continued that conversation throughout the assembly process, and actually almost try to have open opportunities for the public to connect back into the Citizens Assembly, it would create a very different output. But I think in terms of keeping the momentum with the public discourse, I would love to see what would happen if that way of commissioning an assembly could happen now. We really concentrated on communicating what a Citizens Assembly was, and we could have, had we had that drumbeat throughout the assembly, we could have then gone straight in with what was being called for and what impact was being asked for by the time we were ready to launch the plan. But we live and learn. We didn't know what was going to happen before we commissioned it. It was always going to be whatever it was, and we're still very proud of it. It's just all of these things, there's a lot of what could have happened because it's just right at the beginning of what's possible. So yeah, really exciting.
One thing you must, I've said this to you before, Kat, and you mustn't beat yourself up, because you're actually pretty much the first people to try to do what you try to do. And I think this is, again, something we have to reflect on, which is that we have quite a lot of experience about government or public authority sponsored assemblies and some of the downfalls. So, for example, the classic problem of a really enthusiastic climate minister running one of these things, but completely failing to get the rest of the government on board. We've learned those kind of lessons, and we kind of know. If you start asking me about, well, what does a civil society organized impact strategy look like? Actually, there's very few examples to draw on at the moment. And so we are learning by doing. And the very fact that people like you are willing to be open about the kind of challenges you faced means that we can be much more robust in the strategies that we develop in the future. And I think actually this is one of the things I've been really pleased about in this space, is how honest people have been with each other, and really willing to learn from each other. And that's been really valuable. But so I just wanted to reiterate the point that you ended. You didn't have a playbook. You're writing the playbook as you go along. And I think that is something we have to remember. We are writing the playbook as we go along.
Thanks both. David, and then I'd like to have time for at least 1 or 2 questions that have been coming up in the chat. So thanks.
Thank you, Erica. Very briefly, we've had now a dozen of these national climate assemblies across Europe. Would it be possible using AI or traditional clustering work to bring out the 30 most important or most recurrent themes? And could it be an idea that ECF or any other body uses this as a way to scale up and get European massive support for what has been decided and proposed in so many different countries? It would be cheap, it could be massive.
Thanks, David. Yes, I actually was thinking about that when I was reading Graham's book, and just the evidence there about how some of these, well, from the studies that have been done about some of how these sufficiency questions and so on that do come out much more strongly from citizens' demands. We really can ask the politicians to go further, and again having this so noted, but on the this question about basically needing to be much more confident in this alternative way. I want to just try. I mean, there's some really lovely questions in the chat, and I want to just try and sort of put across a couple of them. So I didn't know who asked them, so name check yourself. But how the processes of no, sorry, the one I wanted to start with was how can we sort of build a deeper civic democracy where people step up and actually demand their responsibility to take part in these kind of processes and to help find a common way forward, so that it's not just a passive thing where you wait to be invited, but actually, the public values democracy and the right to participate and protect themselves. I think some answers to that are in what you've already said, but it's a nice question if you want to address it directly. And relatedly, how can the processes of assemblies sort of scale to a more free-flowing, kind of unconstrained system of participatory dialogue among the public? What can that look like? Yeah, that would be great to hear if you have any quick thoughts on that. Thank you.
Sure, I'll start. I mean, in a sense, actually, in both of those, I think Kat's point about the way that they could have had an ongoing conversation around an assembly, I think is really critical. I think one of the problems we've had is we've sort of thought about assemblies in isolation. We've thought about them as a sort of, we haven't thought about what goes on around them. And I think there's been a sort of too much of a sort of rarefication, if you like, or a sort of almost sort of they're so special that we mustn't contaminate them. We mustn't, that we've got to kind of just like really protect these citizens. Now, one of the assemblies that's had most profound effect, although its effect on policy is still debated, is the French Convention. And what they did with the Convention Citoyenne was actually really bring the media into the process. I was just listening to somebody talk about it 2 days ago at an event in Paris, and they were saying they did that with the media. They forgot to bring the politicians in, so they kind of like, and I think this is really interesting because a lot of us in this field are very worried about protecting this space and keeping this sphere pure. It's kind of like, my friend Yves Santomir talks about it almost as like being a anti-political. We actually almost want to just create this non-political space, but this is happening within a broader political system, and I think we have to get real about that. And I think the kinds of things that Kat was talking about thinking about an assembly as part of a broader conversation, as part of a broader process. I think some of the ideas that are coming out of the Humanity Project in the UK around how you link sortition-based assemblies like citizens' assemblies with popular assemblies, which are much more about mobilizing people, I think are really exciting. I know other people are really worried about that, but I think it's a really interesting dynamic. So for me, those are the sorts of answers that I would have, is not thinking that assemblies are the answer to every problem, and thinking about how they get positioned amongst other sorts of participatory and deliberative action. That would be where I would go. I'd be interested to see what the other two think.
In terms of stepping into responsibility as citizens and actually that scaling up and that bottom-up drive, because quite a lot of citizens' assemblies while they come from bottom up in terms of citizens develop the policies, they then pass them to large institutions and say, please enact these. We did a huge amount of work with our assembly. Those that wanted to stay on with us, about 70% decided that they wanted to continue some sort of engagement with us as charities. We worked with a charity called Groundwork in the UK that do a lot of work basically connecting people in their local communities to do some mentoring with the People's Assembly. And we also did some one-on-one mentoring and media training too. And what we've seen is we've had People's Assembly members step into roles on local councils we've had people change their jobs. We've had people locally becoming really key advocates, and they're now a really, really well-known voice in their local region. We've seen the teenagers that came through, they were 16 when they first started, they're now choosing their into university placements based off some of the experiences that they had in the civil, in the Citizens Assembly. And it's really hard to think that, oh, that's going to have any impact. There's only 100 people there, but the ripple effects from their life is really important. And it becomes even more scalable when you add that to the media. And we've done quite a lot of work to make sure that it was always the participants of the Assembly that were fronting our media strategy. It was them on the radio, it was them on the podcasts, it's been them in any of the articles and their story about their transformation through the process. And it is genuinely inspiring, and it could have opportunity to have far more of a ripple effect than I think we really anticipate. I've just heard in the last 2 weeks that one of the participants has started up their own community interest company and is combining their experience of social work with nature prevention for mental health for young people. That's going to have a huge impact in the town of Coventry, where they're from. So we can see that if we actually were able to invest then, as large charities that have that power, into the local spaces where we can get more community action, more communities driving power, and actually creating the spaces and the solutions themselves, we might then get the laddering up effect further down the track and getting the dual. I really genuinely believe in a dual theory of change, where you have lots of community action at the ground, which is in itself putting pressure on that larger scale legislative change that we need. And I think citizens' assemblies are really interesting in helping to catalyse that, which is what I hope we're seeing with the People's Plan.
Thank you. And I think, I mean, almost as another part of the theory of change, there's a really nice comment from Rosa in the chat that some of you might have read, where she's talking about the fact that assemblies actually help to create help to surface the fact that humans do care and have the capacity, and basically, I mean, I paraphrase, but create a culture of kindness, which we're somewhat missing generally. And actually, you know, these processes can help to create the right conditions for that to come out. And one of the things to be looked at is how can we upskill everybody, basically, you know, people who run processes, people who run local authorities, people who run governments, and so on, to actually know how to create those conditions so that those characteristics can come out. Okay. I mean, looking at the time, I think we probably need to be moving to kind of concluding remarks. And then I just want a minute at the end to do the trailer for a couple of the upcoming Knoca events. David or Kat, do you want to give any last thoughts? And then I'll hand over to Graham. You don't have to. You've already shared quite a lot. No, okay. So Graham, over to you. Thank you very much.
I'm not being rude, but that might be the first time I've heard David not take up the offer of speaking. That's really actually, that was really rude. David knows exactly when I'm the one who doesn't know when to stop. Look, this has been really fun. It's been really and it's been really provocative. I think David's intervention is really at the heart of where the work needs to be. I think the example of the kind of work that Kat has been doing is really exemplary in terms of thinking about what some of this might look like in practice. I am honoured to be, it's going to get really sentimental now, but I'm really honoured to be part of a community that is willing to not just talk about this stuff, but do things and do the work. I think sometimes we're not always clear what the work is. I think we need to extend our imagination. We need to extend our creativity. But it is actually really amazing, I think, what we've managed to do as a community and beyond this community, many people who aren't in Knoca, in the last 5 years. If you told me 5 years ago that this is what practice would look like, I wouldn't have believed you. People like myself and David and the people working on this could actually fit in one room. In fact, we did all fit in one room in Paris about 5 years ago. And we all, you know, and now stuff is happening all over the world that I have no idea about. And it's just that to me is really exciting. There aren't many reasons to be positive at the moment. It is a really shit time. And the fact that we have at least one example, I mean, there are many others, but this is just one example of alternative ways of doing things, real utopias, if you like, a real sense that politics could be different. I think is a reason to get up in the morning, is a reason to actually stay invested in this space. The question is, and I think this is the challenge from both David and Kat, is can we do the necessary work around assemblies? We have this special way, we have this special technology. It's one of many ways of engaging citizens and doing politics differently. But there is a lot of work that needs to be done around this. It's not going to be a simple march through the institutions. It's a fight through the institutions. And that's what I think, that's the work we have to do. And it will be, I'm very pleased, proud, privileged to be working on this with so many really fantastic people, many who are on this call and many who will hopefully be watching this afterwards. So please do carry on sharing your ideas, and please do share the book. As I said, it's free, it's short, and it has pictures. What more could you ask for?
Thank you, Graham. Some really nice finishing thoughts there. And I think, yeah, I mean, as David has put out for us, we really do have to, face up to the seriousness and urgency of what's at stake here. But yeah, the cool thing is that there are so many good people working on this. Well, not so many, some good people working on this, and some very good ideas. And what else can we do but keep on trying, I think. And Graham's book gives us a very good guide to do that. So thank you very much, Graham. Thank you so much, Kat and David, for your wonderful interventions. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and for the lots of brilliant comments in the chat, which we'll be saving and digesting, I think, for future future work and follow up as well. There are 2 upcoming Knoca events that I just want to mention. They have been mentioned in the chat. On the 21st of October, there will be a session on revisiting the impact of the French Citizens' Assembly, which, it's an important assembly, so good to know what impact it has or has not had. And a learning call on the Swedish Climate Assembly, this one that's particularly been looking at the systems thinking tools. And that'll be on the 26th of November. And it would be great if you can come to that and tell your friends. So yeah, without further ado, I would like to thank everybody again very much for a good session, and hopefully see you on a Knoca webinar or a real room sometime, somewhere soon. All the best and have a nice evening.